Welcome to the Industrial Real Estate Show. My name is Chad Griffiths, and for the first time in about 6 months, this won't be a live episode, but I pre-recorded this one with an amazing guest. His name is Eric Aderneck. He's one of a fellow industrial real estate enthusiast like myself who puts out a ton of awesome content about industrial real estate, and I really wanted to accommodate his schedule. So that's why we're doing this one pre-recorded. And I'm recording this introduction after our interview, and I know that you're going to get a ton of insight and value from hearing Eric talk. In addition to being a regional planner, he's also a consultant, an author, an instructor, puts out a great weekly newsletter about industrial real estate, including challenges, issues, things to be aware of. And it's a very informative article that I read weekly. And we talk about a number of awesome topics in here, in some of the challenges with industrial real estate, some opportunities, differences between intensification and densification, multi-story industrial, last mile delivery, why some companies don't necessarily want to go out to smaller markets when they have to pay a premium to be in major markets. I think we covered a lot of fascinating topics in this roughly 1 hour chat, and I really do think that you'll enjoy listening to this. So let's jump into it with Eric. Hey, Eric, thanks so much for joining me on the call.
Hi, Chad. I'm glad to be here. Love to talk about industrial lands as you do.
Yeah, you're one of the other content creators in this space who puts out some amazing articles regarding industrial real estate. So it was only natural that the two of us connected to have a meeting of the minds, and probably even more specifically, me to extract as much insight from you as I can on this. So you're based in Vancouver, which I'm guessing a lot of people know how hot of an industrial market it really is. And what I really would like to talk to you about is Vancouver in specifically, but also on how it could relate to other markets all over North America and the world, really, and some of the lessons that you could share on how to approach industrial real estate development from both a planning standpoint as well as just a standpoint of taking a project from an idea all the way to fruition, and then also just some strategies on industrial real estate in general. So if that sounds good to you, we'll jump into it.
That's a big question, but I'll see what I can do. So yes, I'm in Metro Vancouver region. Of course, there's more than just the city of Vancouver here, 21 member municipalities in the area. But in terms of this industrial land conversation, I think it's worth reminding everybody of sort of the obvious points. I mean, what is industrial use and what isn't? That has evolved over time. Conventionally, we kind of call it PDR, production, distribution, repair, is one way of defining industrial uses. Production could be manufacturing or assembly. Distribution could be warehousing, transportation, something involved with goods movement or processing or handling thereof. And then repair is more of perhaps a local serving type of function in terms of industrial, smaller scale, or even heavy commercial, if you want to call it that. The other way to look at all of these really is to think of them on a continuum or a spectrum rather than just yes or no. It could be heavy to light industrial, and that must mean there's a medium level of industrial in between. Big to little, local serving. It could be the repair type of function that is population serving versus something that export oriented, whether it's natural resource processing or handling or something else like that. And then lastly, yet another way of looking at it is from land oriented or land focused activity, something that needs a yard, something that needs a lot of land for truck maneuvering, outdoor storage, as the case may be, maybe a heavier industrial type, versus something that's maybe more modern. And we're talking about an indoor industrial activity. They have to have an activity that's surrounded by a building, the protection from the elements and other purposes. So when we talk about industrial, or we define the amount of activity happening on the land, there's different ways to measure it and count it, and different ways are appropriate for different sectors. And just to give one last example on that, often we talk about the floor area ratio as being more must be better, or more must be more in terms of building, FAR. It does mean more building, but it's not always the right measure for something that's needs a lot of truck maneuvering area or a cross-dock facility or something else like that. The amount of building is quite small. It does not mean the property is underutilized. It simply means that's the right nature for it. And another common measure is the number of employees per square foot or per acre. Again, there's some sectors where it's not very labor intensive, or if robotics or automation is coming online, again, using that measure would provide a inappropriate result. We could have more jobs by building an office building on that land, but that would not be industrial use. That would be office or commercial use. So those are industrial uses, or some of those that I just mentioned, and then over here are non-industrial uses, residential or commercial or retail are something. They're legitimate. They've got to go somewhere in a complete city, but they don't need to or shouldn't be on an industrial use other than perhaps at a very accessory or sort of secondary level to not take away from the primacy of industrial on those lands.
Yeah, that was very well said. And there's a lot of information in there that I'd like to jump into a little bit more. And to your point about differentiating the different classifications of industrial, it's interesting. It's very similar to how I do it, but I guess it speaks to just the nuances in different markets where you mentioned the PDR method. Very similar on how I describe it. Is I like to say there's usually manufacturing properties, there's warehouses, and there's flex properties. Very similar overlap. Manufacturing is things where things are made, can be equipment like a lathe or a CNC or some type of robotics in there. Warehousing is what's become a lot more popular in recent years with distribution centers. And then flex is all the properties that are industrial that aren't necessarily geared to either one of those, but could be a variety of different uses. I'm sure it's similar in Vancouver is in my market where you might find a church, you might find an art gallery, an office space in an industrial zone building, which those aren't traditionally thought of as industrial uses, but they happen to fit under an industrial building. So I want to get into that a little bit more because I think from a planning perspective, a lot of the ordinances and regulations that are in place right now were based on that old model of an industrial building being something where someone was made. And I think 10 years ago, if you asked the average person what an industrial building was, that's what they would say. They'd probably describe a factory. Things are being made. There's noises. There might be a nuisance to the neighborhood. So by design, a lot of these planners and municipalities designed cities that these industrial areas were removed from the view of residents in there, but also just being removed from anybody being able to see it. So you'd have these tucked away industrial parks, but now industrial is changing and it's evolving to, we now see a lot more of these distribution style warehouses, which don't have the smells or the odor or the noise or anything that goes with that. So it's changed. How have you seen in your career the transition from it being traditionally that factory system to it now being a much more elaborate and evolved system of industrial?
Yeah, for sure. That's changed over time, whether the last 20 years or 120 years in terms of economic structural matters. The history of zoning, if you will, goes back maybe 120, 130 years. And the primary reason was to separate two things: residential, where people lived and wanted quiet, non-polluted areas, and industrial, or heavy industrial that we call it now, that had noxious externalities, like you mentioned, pollution, traffic. And even today, you can have these types of uses that do generate those things. And it's truck traffic, it's pollution, it's noise, vibration, dust, other types of things that people don't really want to live by. Those were the separations, and that's the classical definition of why we have zoning. Now, you're quite right. Over time, what is industrial has evolved, and it might be something that's not the smokestack. The pollution regulation is very much different, or it simply isn't that nature at all, and it's something that's interior, indoor oriented, or it's goods handling, which really isn't very dirty at all. It still might make some noise. So on the one hand, that's changed. And I would also point out residential to a certain degree has changed as well. We have things, they're called apartment buildings, that are high rises, whereas 150 years ago, residential was very much a ground-oriented living experience. So if you put those together, then perhaps there's an opportunity to reconsider. I'm not saying throw away zoning bylaws, but reconsider how and why and where the separation ought to be between two uses. I mean, if you go to any downtown city, really, we do have mixed use projects. They might not necessarily be industrial, but there's a residential building, a tower above, there's maybe an office podium, and at grade, there's a retail. And that's considered positive. In fact, those are a combination of facilities and amenities in the right place at the right time and everything. Could something like that be designed in perhaps a slightly different neighborhood, but the ground part was light industrial, or on one side of the building had light industrial, if we're talking about a fairly large building or a site with perhaps multiple buildings on it, and still the residential is physically separated from the industrial by having a height as being that. Now, I'm not saying that's simple, easy, or appropriate everywhere, but I think you're hinting at it, that could be in some places something to look at, given the changing nature of most of those things. And really, all of this, especially in the Metro Vancouver region, is a function of the limited amount of land for almost every use, and the strong demand for land for almost every use, and particularly residential in terms of housing, population growth, economic growth, but also, of course, industrial. And that may be not so much manufacturing as we do have in Ontario or Quebec, perhaps, but certainly the flex type of space, which you mentioned, the local population, and distribution facilities associated with the port and port terminals, and we have a major airport as well. So all those things have to fit into our region, a growing region, and the question is, how do we make the best use of land so that we have more space? Even if we don't have more land, we can, through multi-level building or efficient use, create more useful space.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that there's applications in every market on what you're suggesting, because even markets that don't have physical impediments like Vancouver or other coastal cities, there's obviously an ocean on one side, and then you've either got mountains or just restrictions that you can build in other areas. So it causes physical constraints. But even in markets where you could theoretically build in every direction, there becomes financial constraints where it just costs more and more to service those parcels with infrastructure, whether that's utilities being the obvious one, or just making sure that it has access to fire and police and all the municipal services that you would expect. It becomes more and more expensive the further you go outside a city. So I think all cities are challenged to some extent to try and either avoid that urban sprawl or work within the confines of what you can actually do. And I think that that's where densification comes into play. So a couple topics I want to explore on that, last mile delivery being an obvious one. Companies are all clamoring to get that figurative last mile on the last leg of the supply chain before the product actually goes to the customer's door. That last mile has been picking up a lot of steam over the last couple of years, and I suspect that that's going to continue going forward as customers just expect quicker delivery times. They want to have things available to them. I think that supply chain, that last step in that supply chain of warehouse space is going to become very important. But even just in industrial in general, on how much demand that there still is. You're in a market with sub 1% vacancy, which is in my research is the lowest in all of North America, but there's still other markets that are sub 1, sub 2% as well. So there's a lot of competition for industrial. So maybe we could start there, but and then circle back to the supply chain. What are some of the strategies or mechanisms that a developer or a company can do to actually find property that's suitable for industrial in these land constrained areas?
Well, that is a very big challenge. So, I mean, if again you're referencing some of the latest stats and facts about the market in the Metro Vancouver region, yeah, 0.4, 0.5% is the vacancy rate. That's for existing buildings. If you're looking to lease space as a tenant, if you look through those stats even closer, you'll see in some markets the listings is not low, it's zero. That's your current option right now. And so you've got to literally get in line or act fast if you want to get a space that hasn't come up yet, or be in the know and connected to have yourself well represented when that opportunity comes around and make a quick decision. And that means for the average business tenant, they don't have very many options. They've got to act quick. They've got to make a commitment for a space that may or may not be just right for them because there's fewer options. And also in terms of time, some companies may want a space tomorrow because they have to expand or they're coming to town, and their options are just very limited, especially if you compare that to some other markets where just the dynamics are different. If you go to some large American markets, there's much more supply, vacancy rates higher, the approval process might be a little quicker, and expectations are set a little different. So that's one reality. How do we solve that? Well, we sort of have a fixed amount of land. There is some older industrial lands, 70s buildings, let's say, that were built to a low density, buildings with low ceilings. The specs and stats on them are outdated, if you will. They're functionally barely ideal, or they're obsolete in that way. And so there's opportunities there, and we're seeing it. Developers are buying those properties, knocking down the buildings, redeveloping it, still under the same industrial zone. So this is industrial redevelopment, and putting in higher floor area ratio, higher ceilings for some cases for better racking, modern equipment, power, still needing a certain amount of parking. So the floor area ratio is not, going up all the way to 1 or 2 or something like that. It's in some cases going from 0.25, 0.3 to 0.5 or 0.6. So it is doubling. And then there's other cases in the much more urban types of locations. I'm thinking like Vancouver, Mount Pleasant industrial area, where they really are multi-level buildings and of an industrial and quasi-industrial nature. And in those places, smaller properties, but very much an urban location. There's some land assembly required, and developers go there. You build let's say a 3-story building in some cases that's hitting about 3-floor area ratio. But it's important to recognize the dynamics of that and a suburban location for industrial are entirely just different. So it's hard to just take an average of those two things and say, here's what's going on. That would not be too useful. Rather to say for those areas, the ground floor is light industrial, the upper floor is office or employment. They may be paying a higher rent than industrial, and there's sort of a financial benefit to having those higher value uses on the upper floors, because as a project as a whole, it makes it financially viable. And the other flip side of that is there's more revenue associated with that, more square footage and higher rent rates or lease rates, but the costs are really high. So the land cost would be fairly high for those locations. Construction is going to be quite complex. You need a good design, structural engineering aspects to it are key, as well as elementary architectural interest and variety. But that means underground parking of 1 level and possibly even 2. So the construction cost per square feet are of the office building nature realm of cost, not the tilt up industrial warehouse. So everything is higher and more complicated and more complex and somewhat challenging and costly. But the flip side, if you can make it work, then you've got a ideal long-term asset. You certainly mentioned some of the things that are happening in terms of the economy in the last 2 years, accelerated e-commerce growth. This is hardly a shock to anybody if you've been around and noticed, because of COVID, people aren't shopping like they used to. So there's expectations of goods movement. And Canada compared to London, UK, or parts of the States, our expectations or actual level of service of e-commerce is lower or less. So it suggests by some that there's room still for catching up even after this accelerated 2 years. So that would mean more space for last mile delivery. Like, what does that mean? Well, that probably, or last touch points, if you call it by that. And that means if I'm wanting to order something that goes to the door of my house, it's got to be quick. That distribution center has got to be relatively close to my house. And if I live in a higher density population area, we're starting to talk about urban industrial locations. And those would be places that might not be, and certainly aren't conventional. These are not 500,000 square feet distribution centers. They're neighborhood hubs or urban logistics facilities or something of that nature. They're still being defined. And to have quick deliveries, well, that means closer to the population. It means not a huge truck, a panel van, or even a bike delivery or something like that, and a better type of service in terms of the end producer or consumer for this. Personally, I don't buy much stuff online, so I don't get too excited about this, but it's certainly one of the ways that we have to have our eyes open. And the last point I'll make about this, as you mentioned, even in places where the land is not as constrained as the Metro Vancouver area, I could foresee, and you're pointing at some of these trends that we're seeing in Metro Vancouver, which is perhaps a forerunner of those other places because of the tight land market and uniquely expensive dynamics. Some of those things that are happening now and here, or yesterday and recently, could be happening in part in other markets. So whether it's Metro Vancouver, and as an example in Seattle and a few in New York from time to time, having multi-level industrial buildings, maybe in some right places in some other markets, that'll happen, and perhaps a slightly, not the full form, but in a form. And there's benefits to that. There's, even if land is less expensive in those places, we're using land more efficiently. That's that's good. People are concerned about sprawl in some cases. They usually mean residential single attached house sprawl. Equally, there could be job sprawl. So if we're able to have higher density housing as well as higher density industrial lands, well, those can be using infrastructure more efficiently, using transit service more efficiently, designed in a more complete community way. If you want to go, it's not going to be perfect, or you can't fit all industrial everywhere. I don't want to go that far, but there are avenues for that. And again, I think over time we'll see more and more awareness of this and perhaps interest. And it's up to developers, as they do, to identify where the opportunities may be to go that versus a more conventional development, and make that sort of site-specific development decision, which is informed by location, market dynamics, consumer needs, and of course policy. Municipalities are approving or have a policy regime in place that allows or doesn't allow various types of uses, and I would like to see them allowing the right types of uses. Now, that's a whole other question about what the right type of use is and where, and it depends. But at least having their eyes open to, well, yeah, there's modern types of industrial. Maybe our zoning bylaw from 40 years ago didn't envision this. Or maybe, as I've seen here, there's old industrial zoning bylaws that had building height limits. And why would there be building height limit? Well, to prevent shadows or view corridors or shading. These don't apply at all for industrial areas. But, zoning bylaws have building height restrictions. That's just how we do them normally. So somebody put a number in there, and decades ago, no industrial building was getting even close to that building height. It didn't much matter. It was a totally irrelevant point until recently, where buildings are either going multi-level or they're just going really, really high in terms of ceilings for a cubic area and racking and other uses within it. And all of a sudden, this seemingly irrelevant and outdated zoning provision is kicking in, and a zoning amendment or a development variance permit is required, which is one more step in the approval process, which in those cases is not adding too much value.
You brought up a really good point about the how a site can be designed. And there's the appraisal term, highest and best use, where appraisers will try and figure out from an economic function what the best use is for the owner of that land. But as you mentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best use for the city, or even the best use for the neighborhood, or the best use for the community at large. So how do you determine, and perhaps those two numbers can't even be reconciled, but how do you try to bring those together, the highest and best use from an economic standpoint, as well as the best use from a community or city standpoint?
Yeah, I'm going to have to say those aren't always the same thing. I mean, they're in fact different terms, and sometimes they're in conflict, or there's one that's more merit than the other one in different situations. So, a planner's job depending on the scale, or really at any scale, is to think about the community as a whole and think about all the different ingredients that make a complete community, as we call it these days. There's spaces for jobs, and there's spaces for housing, and there's spaces for other types of uses like parks. I mean, if a developer owned a chunk of land that could be a park, well, that's not exactly a profitable highest and best use, but that's a role for the municipality or a government agency to be operating public or communal facilities, if you will. So I think it is right to recognize there's going to be a bit of tension between those. A municipal planner might have a long-term plan, official community plan. It designates these lands for that use. We have to consider transportation, access to schools, allocation of jobs, taxes, other aspects of it to make for a complete, comprehensive community as well, and the full functional economy. And then on the other hand, there's individual landowners who, of course, have an interest in maximizing the value of their land, or either by its current use or having an eye to redevelopment opportunities. But we can't let each owner do anything they want. We have to say, well, yes, you have an opportunity to develop on that property. It's zoned and designated industrial in your case, if that's the case. So in that case, well, the highest and best use without a rezoning, which may not be appropriate, is in fact industrial. And then we could have a bit of a conversation and say, well, for this part of the town, or when this chunk of land was created 100 years ago and some industrial use was put on there, today it's still industrial, but what could that mean? Let's re-envision industrial or slightly update or tune up the definition of industrial so it could have some modern industrial uses. It could be higher density than in the past. Maybe the transportation and goods network around that site has changed in the last 100 years. I'm sure it has. What is the appropriate use for that site at this day and age? And in some markets, we're seeing that the rents that are being achieved for that new space, or in some cases, really any space that's industrial because of the strong demand, are really high by most standards. And Vancouver has some of the highest rates in North America, I think you could say. And so that becomes more valuable than with the same question 10 years ago.
I've got you triggered a few questions for me on that. So thanks for explaining that as well as you did. One question first. In your experience throughout your career, have you noticed, and I guess this is a two-part question, have you noticed a changing sentiment about industrial real estate from both society as a whole, as well as from municipal planners on how they approach, how they actually regulate the zoning bylaw? So society, has that changed in your mind? And how has municipalities changed to reflect this change in environment?
Well, I don't know if society's changed that much. I think most people are too busy running their daily lives. And if they have an office job or a non-industrial employment, or they don't live by an industrial area, they don't think too much of it, but they should. And during COVID and supply chain disruptions, they've been alert to the fact that when I go to the store and things are sold out, or there's a aspect to a supply chain issue, well, there's the reason why we have industrial lands and need ports and other terminals and facilities. So that's perhaps when eyes are opened in terms of, well, this is manufactured either locally on industrial lands or in Asia on industrial lands and transported over here through a port, a terminal, truck, a distribution facility, and everything else. And other than when there's a problem, kind of like home plumbing, when it works fine, you don't worry about it. But when there is, then it perks people up. So in the last couple of years, I think we could say that a bit more attention to that. Also, I make a bit of a parallel to affordable housing. For many years, and still the case in Vancouver, housing costs have been expensive. That's not actually much of a news story there, but that's been the case. And people point to it and say, well, apartment vacancy rates are 1% in Metro Vancouver, and it's been that way for 20 years. Yes. Well, guess what? Industrial vacancy rates are now at that level or less. Is that worthy as much attention? And should we do something about it? Is it crisis territory? And I would say yes. I'm not sure if everyone else is getting quite as excited about it, but it's definitely something that needs some attention. And from being a prolific news reader, I can see over the years there's been more and more, and I encourage journalists to cover this topic as well. And I've covered it through a number of magazine articles that are written where it's getting some press. And so there is some attention to it from that perspective. The last point I'll make also is for the industrial intensification. Again, I've been doing this for a while. And when I started writing and researching and pressing for industrial intensification, I mean, multi-level industrial buildings or industrial employment on the upper floor, 10 years ago, people would say, that this doesn't make any sense. It's never going to happen here. Or this isn't Tokyo. This isn't Hong Kong or Singapore. That's not happening here. And so now, guess what? A few projects have actually been built. A number more are in the approval process or being discussed or being pre-sold or marketing. And it is happening here. There's examples in other North American cities too. So I think that's definitely an example where eyes have opened or adjustments have been made in terms of what they can see happening. So I've seen and heard real life examples of that. And yeah, we're not Tokyo, we're not Hong Kong. It's not going to be 20-story multi-level industrial. But if we can go to 1 story to 2 or to 3, that's a big win in a sense, but still modest sounding. Rather than going from just conventional development. So eyes have opened to that. And it is a new mini and complex industry of building multi-level industrial, right? The architectural team, and especially structural engineers, have to be really up their game or understand what's being built. The developer has to have a realization that costs are going to be high and the construction period is going to be longer. And I think commercial brokers attracting tenants are going to have to communicate this in a different way. Certainly tenants are asking, well, how would I be on the second floor? I don't want to, how am I going to get there? And well, the answer is somehow, and it's going to be a freight elevator. It's going to be a site with a grade with a ramp, or in some places where there's a slope, two-story building, access from top level, bottom level in terms of different sides of the building. Those are all unique, and depending on the site and design preference and solution, they could vary. But an operational perspective, the tenant's going to say, well, I have this many deliveries by courier. I need this type of a truck. We actually need flex space and we need these types of loading doors or other types of things. Or I have this many employees, where are they going to park? And those are entirely legitimate, valid questions and concerns that they should be asking, because they need a functional space. And the developer and designer and marketing team are going to say, well, we've thought about those. Here's how this building's accessed. Here's how it's going to work. The type of industrial tenant on the ground floor might be different than the upper floor. The load bearing capacity and column spacing and access of level 1, level 2 are different situations, and the right tenants are going to be different for different parts of the building. Nothing wrong or unusual about that. It's just the answer might vary by floor as well.
So that actually leads really neatly into the next question I had for you. And that, just to get your thoughts on why companies and developers aren't considering moving more inland versus competing so aggressively. And by competing aggressively, they're paying really high rental rates for the limited amount of space that's even available. Why don't these companies and developers just go in, whether it's Vancouver, whether it's Los Angeles or Inland Empire? Why don't these companies and developers just consider going in 100 or 200 miles inland?
Yeah, I mean, people do pay for a good location. And although it's expensive here, I would say it's high value as well. I mean, there's a lot of affordable industrial land in Detroit, but you don't see people running out to get it these days. So there is a business decision about where they want to operate. I would, it varies by one. It varies in terms of other business decisions about where to put their corporate headquarters, where to put their manufacturing plant, where to put their distribution center can vary as well. But really, real estate, even though it's expensive, and I'm not taking away from that, labor is the main cost for most businesses. In fact, real estate accommodations could be 3%, 5% of their total bill. 80% or something like that could be for labor. It varies by sector, but that's a bit of an arrangement. So if they're looking at it that way, and they say, well, we need to be by the action in terms of by a port terminal where things are imported or exported, by a population so that we have labor for a distribution center, by the customers or other businesses that are consuming our product or supplying it. There are regional economies or agglomerations that are, in fact, if you have a large population, and you could benefit from those things, including close to the labor pool. If we had a location that was decidedly removed from that, well, maybe it has a highway access. It's on a highway, let's say. But when you're talking about getting employees and retaining employees for managing turnover and attracting a workforce and having inputs and outputs at that location, it would be a very much different conversation. So it might be appropriate for some unique types of uses, or perhaps some natural resource processing type of activity, or something that's atypical. But for the most part, businesses, the primary reason is to be where the action is, depending on what type of sector they're in. And that means the Metro Vancouver region. Now, the region is reasonably big, and you could stretch it out and say the whole lower mainland from, Vancouver, West Vancouver, all the way east to either Langley or Abbotsford or Chilliwack or Hope. And the dynamics of those areas vary by place. And certainly the interurban locations have much more commercial land, residential values for industrial as they are there are much higher. And there is a solution, perhaps not there, half an hour east or an hour east, but even within that region, businesses are making that same decision and saying, well, not 200 miles away, but 50 miles away or 50 kilometers away, what does it look like? And yes, they're tempted to move because there's more land or it's a bit less expensive. But on the other hand, if they were to move, half their workforce would say, I live close by, you lost me. Literally, I'm not following you. And they might say, well, we're going to this other city, and that other city has a reasonable labor pool, and there will be a disruption, but we will find new staff and it'll work out. But there's other sectors that are maybe the software, high-tech ones, labs, design studios, or other stuff that may or may not be industrial, and their preference and requirement to be by a educated, dynamic labor pool is absolutely the key thing. And they're not going to, save a couple bucks per square foot per year on rent in order to really shoot themselves in the foot in terms of losing their staff.
Yeah, that was a great answer to that question, and it's a question that comes up quite often. Whether I hear about a developer that's considering building or developing a 500 acres half an hour out of our market, or someone that's just saying, well, we can lease a space half an hour away for much less. And I like how you describe that, because no single decision is made in a vacuum. You can't just say, I'm going to save 50% on my rent, or I'm going to save 50% on the cost for land by locating this far out of the market, without looking at what it does to other expenses that you have. And labor is a great one. Another one is transportation. What are the implications for how much it's going to cost to travel back and forth, or to get supplies, or to get product to your customer? So you factor in labor now and transportation. Are you actually saving money in the long term, or is a decision like that actually detrimental to the company? So I really liked how you explained that, because that should help clarify for people that are looking at that. It's not a vacuum. Everything that you do has consequences. There might be benefits, but there could be consequences too.
Yeah, they have to look at it a longer term program as well, and holistically as well. So you're quite right. I mean, there's a long list of impacts on this. And transportation, I mean, just think of it, if you have a truck driver working for you and they could do 4 trips a day versus 6 trips a day because your facility is located close to the destinations and origins. I mean, that's got to be a measure of effectiveness, and it will cost you more in the long haul. And now we're increasingly concerned about traffic or GHG emissions or energy consumption, and gas and diesel prices are going up too. And that would be just one more reason to be at the right location. And I bring it back also to what we talked about earlier of e-commerce acceleration. Again, those number of deliveries that a company can make is increasingly important. If people are to expect a delivery in half an hour, like some of the companies promise, well, there's simply no way that that facility can be a half an hour drive away from my house if it's going to be a delivery within half an hour.
Yeah, the logistics, just the math doesn't support that logistical problem there. I think we touched on last mile delivery, but I suppose a good place to wrap up on this is to get your thoughts on last mile delivery as an opportunity, on where either developers or companies could find these last mile opportunities, but also just in a broader context, to get your thoughts on what's about to happen in 2022 here. I know nobody's got a crystal ball. I've said numerous times that mine's the most murky of them all. But just if you were to guess on what rising interest rates, problematic inflation, looming recession, all these factors that were hitting with us, if you were to just throw a dart at the dartboard, where do you see opportunities and where do you see challenges for the latter part of 2022?
You do make it sound dreadful, but I think we'll live through it. I guess a few things. I'm probably not any wiser about the future than you are or others, but I would just make a couple points that I know of. So one, in our Metro Vancouver market, a lot of these industrial or multi-level industrial projects have been strata tenure. So condominium ownership, often pre-sales, and investors or tenants buy them. This is just like apartments and stratas and condos. And those can be very cost effective and beneficial for the buyer for a number of reasons. They build up equity, the security of tenure, the long-term commitment, investment, if you will, for them. But if interest rates are going to be higher, will that change the dynamics? And in those cases, would the developer, perhaps partnered with a REIT or a pension fund or something else, still build the same thing, the exact same building, and except the tenure is leasehold and it's marketed in a different way, and you pay per square foot in terms of rent instead of buy? I expect one that sounds like I would expect what's going to happen in the future. I would think the building design and the density would be the same as before, but I don't know if somehow there'd be a reason why lease tenure might dictate a slightly different preference in terms of the building design or other facilities or common areas, perhaps. In terms of the other aspects for it, I mean, I see e-commerce growth continuing to grow. It does introduce the flip side, which is the pain of the retail market. So we're seeing places, it's no secret that retail stores are struggling. Restaurants are back in some way, or for a while they were operating in terms of just distribution of food. So you look at those retail places and you say, well, what can you do to fix those up? Can there be customers coming back to those areas? In some cases, it's not just because of COVID and people not wanting to go to stores. Those stores and restaurants may be at the bottom of the downtown central business district, physically at the grade level, and the office buildings above it, not because of industrial reasons, but because of COVID reasons. There's fewer employees, and so there's fewer people going shopping during the lunch break, and etc. So what does it mean for that? The reason I sort of make that reference is we can't change the past. I mean, what's been built could perhaps be adapted or converted, but in future developments, would we say, well, maybe we don't need as much retail as a conventional mixed-use development or urban development. Maybe instead of, we still have employment space or commercial space, but some of that is a little bit of the light industrial over at the back of the building. And that functions as an urban distribution facility or something like that, where we weren't thinking about that 2 or 3 years ago, but it's still important and it's useful. And noting the uptick of industrial and the downtick of retail, we make those two adjustments, and the same amount nets out, same amount of building, but the design and the functionality would be different. But that's meeting the needs for us moving forward. The last couple points I would say, again, I don't know the future, but there's other trends that are like reshoring, if you want to use that term, instead of just-in-time delivery where we're getting products. It's more of a notion at factories where they're assembling things just in time. But here for retailers or other operations where they say, well, the goods chain, the goods supply chain is fragile, or it can be impacted by COVID or port strikes or who knows what. And so in that case, to make sure that we have enough goods, we want to have more than just in time. We want just in case. And that means you're ordering more stuff, but also once the stuff gets there, if you're having a retailer or you're having some sort of industrial or commercial facility, there's more stuff that's got to be stored. Because instead of just having 5 days supply, I want 3 weeks supply in case something goes bad. So I think that's going to be a driver of, I've got physically more stuff that I've got to have for my business on site just in case. And where's that going to go? And does that mean I need more industrial space? Oh, yes, but rents are really high and there's a limited supply. Does that mean I finally invest in some better racking so equipment can go up, or I get a new forklift and the ceiling goes higher, and that takes a little bit more programming and designing and thinking, well, I'm going to put the stock there and I'm going to not touch it for 3 weeks, or make sure it's at the right place and I got this nice inventory management system rather than just eyeballing it or doing it the old-fashioned way and it's all within hand level. It's a different type of thing. So that's a way of using the space more efficiently. And it doesn't have to be all high tech. It doesn't have to be glamorous. Not all of this is multi-level industrial and amazing big things. Those could be modest sized examples of where we're going. And the last point, I could have made this at the beginning, was to sort of separate the notions of industrial intensification and industrial densification. I hinted at the very beginning, there's different ways to measure industrial activity. So this is what I call it, and I'm trying to get everyone to use the same language. Of industrial densification is the amount of building. So floor area ratio, floor square feet. So if you've got more building, whether it's a higher site coverage or just a multi-level building, there's more square footage and more potential activity there. And you read the right measures, square feet or square feet ratio. The flip side of that, well, it's not totally the flip side, but there's some overlap, is the amount of industrial activity or intensification. And in those cases, it might not mean more building. It just means more activity. And activity could be number of workers. It could be the amount of truck, trailer deliveries and pickups, the amount of value add, the number of widgets that are packaged or handled or processed through your facility. And you can imagine some of those activities don't need more building. I could have a factory where there's one shift of employees for 8 hours. And then I say we're really busy. What are we going to do? I'm not building a second factory. I'm getting a night shift in there, and there's going to be twice as many employees, not at the same time. They'll be spaced out. But you drive by the building, same amount of floor area, amount of activity and value add that is very much different or doubled in those cases. So these are things that are sometimes overlapping, but sometimes different. And more building is one measure of densification, or more employees is one measure, but it's not the only measure. It's not the exclusive one. And in some cases, it might not even be right. I mean, if we're talking about full automation, the number of employees is robots, and you don't, there's no employees. And you don't really need employees that are robots, don't need car parking. So then maybe you have more building and less parking. Other types of amenities on site vary as well. And the notion of what we're producing or what the activities are of the economy is evolving as well. So instead of measuring the number of widgets, the widget is a product that's a different type of thing. And it's not as physical and conventional as an old-fashioned widget. It's something modern, or it's knowledge, or R&D, or something else that's appropriate for a flex space or a quasi-industrial space.
Yeah, I really like that answer because we hear so much in the news, and I try to stay away from mainstream media whenever possible because it seems like they just try to sensationalize everything. But it seems like when you do turn in, you're being bombarded with looming recession and interest rate hikes and inflation that's spiraling out of control and whatever superlatives they use at any given time. But I agree with everything you said there. There's still a lot of reasons to be bullish and optimistic about industrial real estate. And I would even add on there on the reshoring point that you made, not just having more safety stock, which will in turn require more warehouse space. I think that there's a case to be made that manufacturing should actually be reshored to some extent in North America. And without opening up a whole nother conversation, which we might have to have part two on this, all these companies that are saying that ESG is such an integral part of their operations going forward, it doesn't seem logical to me that these companies would have something made overseas, not necessarily something complex like a silicone chip or something, but let's just say like a cup like this. If to have that cup made in China, made in a factory, sent to a warehouse, sent across rail across China, sent across the ocean in an ocean container, landing in a port, going to a warehouse at a port, going across North America on rail, going to another warehouse, going to a last mile facility, and then get delivered to my door. That doesn't seem like a socially or environmentally friendly way of doing business when this same cup could be made in Detroit, where there is a surplus of land available, like you mentioned, and it doesn't have to go all the way across the country and take on all those emissions at the same time. So that's me getting a little far out there and almost on the cusp of being a rant. But I do think that if these companies want to take ESG seriously, they're going to have to give major consideration to the environmental impacts of shipping something all the way across the world for the sole reason of saving money. So I think that there's a good case to be made that manufacturing could reshore to North America at some point as well.
Yeah, well, stay tuned. I mean, I suppose part of the question is, will consumers be wanting to pay more if that leads to a higher cost? And some might, some not. There's also the notion of local food production and other types of things that are both sustainable and resilient and a form of ESG, you might say. Mm-hmm. So in some places it might work, in others it's a further conversation.
It'll be one of those tensions, and we talked a lot about tension on this show. There's complexities and tension and all of this. This will be another indication of the tension. Will people pay more for product that actually is ESG, or is there just a lot of lip service right now? That will be something fascinating to watch going forward on that. And I certainly don't have an answer, but I think that there's, circling back to it, I still think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about the industrial market, even if the economy technically does go into a recession.
Well, let's hope for the best, for sure. Prepare for the worst, but I don't think it's going to be quite so bad. But there's always a chance of something going that way. But for right now, we still see strong demand for industrial, even looking beyond, month to month or quarterly stats and facts. I mean, when I say there's strong demand for industrial, I'm not too concerned about the short term, although I realize investors and brokers may feel a little differently about that. But if you just look at the fundamentals, we still need the space. Population's growing, the economy is growing, the nature of industrial is evolving, not declining, and that's got to go somewhere, and it's got to be found in a responsible way. So that's part of the ongoing conversation, and I applaud you for running these programs to get the conversation going.
Well, and likewise, I'm a big fan of the articles that you're putting out, and I'll talk about that in a second. But just curious, what led you to industrial and to be a student of it, and on your path, like you're a certifiable expert on it. What took you from that curious student to where you are today?
Sure. Well, that's a bit of a background story. I mean, I have a business degree as well as a planning degree. And so I have an interest in the economy and how development and other things are related to it, not just land use planning. Because if we have land use plans that are nice or theoretical and not viable or not built or don't consider different sectors of the economy, it's not a complete community or we're overlooking things. So my interest in this is saying, well, it's not just land use, it's a huge amount of the economy. In our Metro Vancouver region, we have some stats that suggest about 4% of the land in the region is industrial, and it has 27% of the jobs in the region.
Oh.
So it's not just land, it's jobs, it's a tax base, it's a goods movement associated with it, how it goes in and out of the port, the terminal, YVR, the airport, and other aspects. So it's sort of an overlooked, unloved, not usually sexy topic in the planning profession, as I will, because usually most planners are interested in green things or social aspects or mixed use or urban development, which of course is important and gets much press and attention. But only lately, and not everybody, but we're getting there, is interested in the industrial aspect. So that's my niche topic. I'm always happy to talk about it. Whether again on the show, your watchers can certainly reach out to me, or you can post my website. I'd be happy to have conversations with you about this and share any other information I have.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to put your contact information in the description. And I'd encourage people to sign up for your newsletter as well. I'm an avid reader of it. How frequent are you putting that out right now?
Right now, I send out a newsletter, a distribution list once a week in terms of hot topics in the news about planning and development related matters. Some of it, much of it's industrial, but other types of things that are relevant. And from being I teach as well, and from telling students about this, I mean, really anything, 3/4 of things in the newspaper, even if they don't have the word planning on it, is probably a planning related thing, whether it's traffic congestion or too many kids at the school or not enough bus stops or lack of space for jobs or interest rates going up or down. There is a planning and development connection to it.
Yeah, and some of the articles that I've read of yours, and you've shared some interesting ones with me in addition to that too. It's great insight. So I think for anybody that's in the industrial real estate space, and even more broadly, people that perhaps just even have a cursory interest in it, I think getting a deeper understanding of it just puts you in a position to understand the wheels of commerce. And if you're involved in it, the more knowledge that you have, I think the better prepared you are to make educated decisions. So I'll put all your contact information in there and encourage people to subscribe to your newsletter. And Eric, thank you so much for joining me on this call. I'd love to continue this conversation down the road as well.
Thank you, Chad. I appreciate it as well. Happy to follow up and perhaps next time in person.
That'd be fantastic. Either when I'm in Vancouver, if you're in my neck of the woods, I'd love to grab coffee.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Eric.